Good evening, everybody. Colostrum and hygiene. To me, these are the two key factors which are going to keep your calves healthy for the coming spring. So if we think about humans, when babies are in utero, there is transfer of antibodies between the mother and the baby. So we are born with a developed immune system. However, when the calf is in utero, there's no transfer of antibodies between the cow and the calf. So this means that the calf is dependent on colostrum to develop that immune system. Now, if we think about firstly where the calf is born, this means that if the calf has an underdeveloped immune system, it is critical that it is born into a clean environment, because if it isn't, it's at risk of picking up any bugs that are in that environment. So just to recap on the colostrum 1, 2, 3, and again, if you can just keep this in your mind every time a calf is born, I think it's a really simple way of remembering exactly what to do. So the first milking, 1 stands for the first milking and only the first milking, because this is what is colostrum. Milkings 2 to 8 are transition milk, and they do not have enough antibodies to give to the calf for its first feed. Only that first milking, the colostrum, contains enough antibodies to kickstart that immune system. 2, that means to feed within 2 hours of birth, because this is when the absorption of those antibodies is maximum, and it decreases over time and falls off pretty rapidly until the calf is 24 hours old, when it can't absorb any more antibodies from the colostrum. However, that said, there is still a benefit to feeding transition milk because it can line the gut and help against scour. And 3, this stands for feeding 3 litres. And by feeding 3 litres, that will ensure that the calf is after receiving enough antibodies to get that immune system going. So when we talk about producing high quality colostrum, again, we're back to the hygiene. Hygiene, hygiene, hygiene. We need to make sure that everything that we're collecting the colostrum in is spotlessly clean. And equally, anything that the calves are fed their colostrum through, or their milk for that matter, is also spotlessly clean. I'm sure we've all been on farms where we've seen buckets that are filthy dirty with lots of bacteria and fungus on them. You can imagine with that buildup of bacteria, it's going to go against the calf in terms of their health. So what we're looking for is very clean equipment. It was actually very interesting in a recent survey that we did when we went out on farms. We took samples of the feeding equipment for calves that were fed. So buckets, bottles and teats, automatic feeders. And the dirtiest pieces of equipment that we found were actually the stomach tube and the bottle and teat. The very first thing that that calf is fed with, the colostrum going through it. So if there's one thing that you do this year, it's to make sure that those feeding implements are cleaned after each use, and spotlessly clean at that. So to look at the factors which affect colostrum quality, I guess the main one that we need to consider is time from calving. So as the cow calves, when the cow has calved and as the time progresses on, the cow signals have been sent to the brain for it to produce more milk, which is essentially diluting down the antibodies. So we have a 9-hour window where we can collect that colostrum, because after this, the quality begins to reduce and doesn't contain enough antibodies to feed to the calf for its first feed. So for example, if you have a cow and she calves at 8 o'clock at night and isn't milked again until 8 o'clock the next morning, the quality of her colostrum will be a lot lower than if, say, for example, she calved at 5 o'clock in the morning and was milked again at 8. The next factor which can affect colostrum quality is lactation number. So often it's said that heifers' quality of colostrum is a lot poorer than mature cows. However, this is often not the case. We have found in many of the experiments that we've done that heifers have good enough quality colostrum to feed to the calf for the first feed. But the only way you're going to know this is by checking the quality, and we'll come on to that in a moment. The next factor just to be aware of is month of calving. So in general, from studies that we have done in Teagasc Moor Park, we have found that the later calving cows, so cows calving, we say in April, May, that the quality of their colostrum tends to be lower than cows that calve earlier in the season. So one thing that you can do is when you're at peak calving and there's an excess of colostrum, you can take that colostrum and store it in the fridge or in the freezer. And the last thing just to be aware of is the volume. So cows that produce a higher volume generally tend to have poorer quality colostrum. But again, we're not going to know unless we test it. So there's a very simple, cheap tool that should be part of your equipment for the calving season, and that's called a Brix refractometer. So you can get them and they're less than €50 and they can be easily purchased online, or maybe some of the co-ops have them in store. And the way they're used is that you take a few drops of colostrum, place it on the refractometer, look through the eyepiece, and then you will see this scale. And the refractometer you want goes from 0 to 30. And what you're looking for when you look through the eyepiece is how far that white or the lighter colour comes up. And what we want is a value of 22% or greater. So once it's 22%, that means that there is enough antibodies in that colostrum to feed to the calf for its first feed. If there isn't enough antibodies, or if it's below the 22%, don't feed that as a first feed. You could potentially keep it and feed it as a second feed. So once we have determined the quality of colostrum, we know that we're going to feed it within 2 hours, and we know that we're going to feed 3 litres. However, a lot of people store their colostrum. So what we want to just make sure is that if we're storing that colostrum, we're doing it correctly, so we're getting the maximum benefit out of it. So colostrum can be stored in a fridge or a freezer, but the key thing is to store it within 3 hours of collection, because after this, the bacteria in the colostrum grows exponentially, and it essentially binds to the antibodies, and then they can't be absorbed by the calf. So for that reason, we're saying into a fridge or a freezer within 3 hours. If we put it into the freezer, it will last for up to a year in the freezer, and in the fridge, it will last for up to 48 hours. And the key is, if you're storing it in your fridge in bottles, that you write on the bottle the day, the date, the time that it goes in. For example, the 18th of January, AM or PM, and that you're checking that fridge every day or twice a day, and you're just throwing out anything that is over 48 hours old, because once it goes over the 48 hours, there's too much bacteria on it for the calf. So freezing colostrum comes with a warning, and that is around defrosting. You have to be very careful how you defrost your colostrum. So no boiling water and no microwave to defrost it, because you're at risk of killing the antibodies. So what you can do to defrost it is you need to keep your water at less than 60 degrees. If you look at the pictures that are on screen, you can see it can be frozen in either a bottle or a bag. With the bag, there's a greater surface area, so it's going to take a lot less time to defrost than if with the milk carton. Because if you think the thickness of that and how long it's going to take to defrost into the middle, it'll take quite a while. But a word of warning with the bags: don't put the bag straight into water, because there's a high risk that the corners have frayed, and then the colostrum can run into the water. A good idea is to get a steel bucket, so get a larger steel bucket, fill it with warm water less than 60 degrees, put a smaller steel bucket into that, and put your colostrum into that. After 15 minutes or so, you can change the water again, and that will make sure that you're speeding up the defrosting process where possible. And finally, just to finish by saying that antibody absorption is increased when colostrum is fed warm. There's no problem feeding cold milk as long as you're consistent in what you do, but colostrum should always be fed warm. Even if it's coming out of the fridge, it should be warmed in the method that I just went through to defrost, and that will ensure the maximum uptake of antibodies. So at this point, I'd like to wish you the best for the forthcoming calving season and hand back to Stuart.